While lightsabers are typically thought of as being able to cut through anything, over the years, Star Wars has introduced various materials able to resist, withstand, or entirely negate contact with lightsabers. So today we're going to be breaking the best ones down. The one that'll be most familiar to people, given its prominence in shows like The Mandalorian, is Beskar, known originally just as Mandalorian Iron, after its introduction in the Tales of the Jedi comics from the early 1990s. While the ability to withstand a lightsaber hit doesn't necessarily come from a material just being super hard, in Beskar's case that's pretty much exactly what's going on. When we first see Beskar in the form of some manacles, it's described as being able to hold a Jedi, and then when we see it again later on in Tales of the Jedi, it's being used to encase the tomb of a Sith Lord Freeden Nad, which Sith hopeful Exar Kun needed to break into. There's basically a full page dedicated to getting into that tomb, where it highlights the inability of Exar Kun to penetrate the iron encasing the tomb, a problem which Kun creatively solves by turning the power on his lightsaber up. So at least at this point, Beskar isn't completely impermeable. You may actually remember this as one of the tombs you get to break into in Knights of the Old Republic 2 on Duxin as well. As Beskar starts showing up later on, especially in the Republic Commando books, where Karen Travis gives it the name Beskar, it's basically the typical material we now see Mandalorian armor being made of, something which continues on through the show The Mandalorian and in the Legacy of the Force series, where they find a big vein of Beskar in the wake of the Yuuzhan Vong scarring of Mandalore, and then they even start trying to produce starfighters out of it, thinking that this will be behind a big resurgence in Mandalorian power in the galaxy. So essentially, Beskar's lightsaber-resistant qualities come from it being a faction-specific adamantium equivalent to help show how the Mandalorians were the most bestest unbeatable guys ever, with part of their training regiment being to like and subscribe for more videos. With Beskar, and with some of the materials we'll be getting to later on this list, its limited use comes mostly from being incredibly rare and expensive, otherwise you'd probably see it almost everywhere. On the opposite end of the spectrum though, and spoilers for the Acolyte episode 5 here, we have our second of these materials and the most recent entry into live action, Cortosis, a material which we've now seen worked in the armor and helmet of Chimere. As we see in the show, this material shorts out lightsabers when they come into contact with it. While slightly more recent than Beskar, Cortosis also has an almost 30-year history behind it in the lore as well. It was first mentioned in a pair of novels in 1998, I, Jedi and Vision of the Future, with I, Jedi being the place to first and most directly bring it up, and then Vision of the Future referencing that original I, Jedi appearance as well. Luke Skywalker and Corran Horn, the titular I, who is a Jedi, come into contact with a Force-using Jedi splinter sect called the Jensari, who weave Cortosis fibers into their armor, a process which, in the Jensari tradition, outweighs even the construction of their lightsabers in importance. Cortosis also plays an important role in the Plagueis novel, where Plagueis kills his master Darth Tenebris in a Cortosis mine on the planet Beldemnik. Usually Cortosis is portrayed as being just able to short out a lightsaber, however some comics and games like Knights of the Old Republic use Cortosis a bit more like Beskar, having it resist lightsaber strikes without just shutting down the lightsaber. Usually this is done by having Cortosis be part of some alloy so you can have other melee weapons stand up in lightsaber fights. This is important because the use of Cortosis and most of its functions aren't about it being particularly physically strong, it's just that it can resist lightsabers. When it's introduced in I, Jedi, Mirix Tarek notes Cortosis as being nice ornamentation in the armor, but kind of useless outside what it does to lightsabers. We kind of see this in the Acolyte as well. Once Jeki and Sol figure out they can't hit Chimere with their lightsabers, they punch his mask instead, and Jeki basically breaks it when it comes off, just at the back though. So it's great if you're worried about fighting Jedi, it's less good if you want to fight everyone else. The Darth Bane novels do mention it being useful in other types of armor, but that's again mostly for anti-energy properties rather than because it can withstand actual hits particularly well. And I think that portrayal in the Darth Bane novels is probably the broadest application that gets implied. Mara Jade explains the function of Cortosis as causing a feedback loop in the lightsaber's electrical systems, overloading it and shutting it down, something that doesn't really apply to other things which aren't going to be in contact with the Cortosis. Though Mara's explanation there does at least imply some other anti-energy properties as well. When it comes to the weapons in Knights of the Old Republic, you can probably think of the weapons that don't shut lightsabers down as having a more localized anti-energy effect and using smaller amounts of Cortosis and an alloy to leave more room for actual stronger materials materials like Durasteel or something. That would at least give a reason that the swords aren't complete garbage, and why they don't shut down lightsabers entirely, at least if you want a headcanon reason to kind of explain how that happens. KOTOR does specifically note them as being Cortosis alloy weapons as far as I can remember, so I think there's at least some in-text support for that interpretation. But during the Clone Wars, Cortosis was also used to create the CB3 Battle Droid's armor, a lightsaber-resistant version of the Super Battle Droid which was used in the New Droid Army Game Boy Advance game. We've already basically covered why this would be a bad idea to make general armor out of, but even just against lightsabers, it wasn't perfect. You could still cleave the droid in half from above in areas where the Cortosis wasn't protecting it, making the whole thing kind of questionable, and that probably explains why you never see it again. Overall, though, Cortosis is less consistent in how it's used in different sources than, say, Beskar is, but I think part of that is because it works in a more nuanced way than Beskar does, where Beskar is just kind of the typical sci-fi very strong material, so I kind of prefer the specific application interpretation of Cortosis over Beskar, or the more general good armor interpretation of Cortosis. But after all that, you may be thinking, frick, that's a lot of stuff that can resist lightsabers, and you'd be correct, our next material is Frick, and it can resist lightsabers. Frick was an alloy first introduced in the Dark Forces game in 1995, where it's being used in the armor of Dark Troopers. WebRPG supplements tie that story, with Kyle Katarn investigating the Dark Troopers, back into Mandalorian armor indirectly, 10 years after their introduction, by mentioning Frick as being a key component of Fennelar armor. The Fennelar are a species who were exterminated in the early Mandalorian Crusades, and Mandalorians incorporate part of the tech of the species they conquer into their own, which may be meant to imply that this inspired how Beskar was smithed, and led to some improvements in that Beskar technology. The notable quality of Frick, much like Beskar, was less that it was lightsaber specific in what it could resist, and more back in the vein of general super armor. There's another material in this vein described as even stronger than Frick called Impervium, which we can probably assume could also resist lightsabers, but it's much more rare and there's way less lore on it, so I can't really do a dedicated section for it in the same way. But Frick at least gets mentioned as being used in places like the Magna Guard Electro Staves, which we do see as being able to resist lightsabers, and also in Palpatine's lightsaber itself. Overall, I'm not aware of any place that goes super deep into its specific capabilities. It seems to be somewhere south of Beskar in power, being able to resist lightsabers, but not quite entirely negate them. Maybe putting it more in line with what we see of the Beskar tomb in the early Tales of the Jedi comics. But kind of like Cortosis, it's mentioned as having energy dispersal as part of its properties. Generally though, Frick, like the other materials mentioned, falls into the category of, we need people to be able to put up fun fights for the Jedi, so how can we do that if lightsabers could just cut through anything? And then answering that by saying, well, what if they just couldn't? That's going to do it for our look at the lightsaber-resistant materials of Star Wars though. Thank you for watching, and remember to leave a like or subscribe for more if you've enjoyed the video.